Eruption 10, the technology gap. So, now that the foundations have been laid, we're at the point where things are going to really start building on each other. This should mean more narrative fiction and less textbook-like walls of explanation. I appreciate you taking the time to read through the first few articles, and remember they are always there if you need a reference or a refresh. The tech industry is the cornerstone of the economies of the Republic of California and the Cascadian Confederation. Silicon Valley alone accounts for much of California's economy, both in-universe and in real life, and similarly, the Puget Sound area holds the lion's share of Cascadia's. The personal computer revolution was well underway by 1985, and many well-known technology companies had already been founded by this point. The leaders of the newly independent West Coast very quickly made the conclusion that technology would be the key to the new nation's survival, both economically and militarily. As the defense departments began securing military technologies under Operation Paperclip II, the civic leaders began meeting with the CEOs of companies like Microsoft, Apple, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, AMD. A who's who of the tech world had descended on Olympia and Sacramento. Their aim was to secure appropriations for research, yes, but most importantly, to ensure that free trade, and by extension their profit margins, were not to be infringed upon. So, a gentleman's agreement was struck. The new governments support free trade in the tech industry, provided the tech industry actively supports and contributes to infrastructure improvement programs and advanced defense research projects. Woven into the very core of California and Cascadia is a symbiotic relationship wherein they protect the tech companies and the tech companies protect them. This approach was also applied to the university system on the West Coast as well. In 1987, the Pacific Research Laboratory Foundation was established to provide grants and scholarships directly from the tech industry to the universities, as well as act as a unified governing body for the national laboratories in both nations. By the end of the 1980s, these research institutions were back in full swing. The computer science departments at the major universities were pushing the boundaries of robotics, artificial intelligence, and ever faster supercomputers. All the while, the national laboratories at Livermore and Richland were once again at the cutting edge of material science and theoretical physics. Finally, the Pacific Space Agency was founded, with its headquarters at the former NASA Ames Research Center in San Jose. The PSA would also take over the Test Flight Research Center at Edwards Air Base and begin construction on a satellite factory in Renton. Their primary launch site would be Vandenberg Air Base. Trade with East Asia would be essential for the West Coast and its tech companies. The one thing they didn't have was the infrastructure for large-scale production of semiconductors and other core components, but they found friends across the sea who did. There's a reason that the terms of free trade were listed before joint defense in the Pacific Partnership Treaty. Economics was on everyone's mind as the dot-com revolution was underway. On the subject of the Internet, the severance of the North American telecommunications system had a lasting impact on the early Internet. As referenced earlier, phone and data lines were still intact up and down the West Coast, and even across the Pacific and into Canada and Mexico. In the United States, however, not only were the phone lines across the Rockies destroyed, but much of the telecommunication grid in the East was offline for years. This created a, quote, information gulf, wherein the United States was isolated from much of the news from the outside world and limited their involvement in the development of the Internet. With much of the development of the Internet centered on the West Coast, it effectively led to them having de facto control over cyberspace, which would have consequences for decades to come. To their credit, technological development did continue in the United States once the initial aftermath of Yellowstone had been resolved. IBM still reigned as a powerhouse in the business technology sector. They would hold the largest share of the market in the United States going forward. Of course, many of the tech businesses based in the eruption zone would be entirely lost, though. Compaq, Dell, Motorola, and Texas Instruments are well-known examples that would either go bankrupt or just vanish entirely, along with many other smaller firms. American tech products would still noticeably lag behind those produced in the new nations or East Asia, and paradoxically were also more expensive due to the increased cost of importing components. Not only did the US lose its easy access to the Pacific, by formally cutting ties with most of the countries that produced microprocessors and other components, the American tech companies would be forced to go through a third-party broker or negotiate imports on their own. Consequently, the demand for American tech dropped sharply outside of the US, causing there to be less money for R&D, leaving the Americans further behind, and so on. We'll circle back to this point later, but this also led to the American economy backsliding into more of an industrial economy, focusing more on export of raw materials and heavy industries. The divide between the West Coast and the US would continue to widen throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, eventually leading to the term the technology gap being coined in American foreign policy and defense research circles, harkening back to the missile gap fears of the 1950s. This time, though, the gap was not theoretical. The difference in quality and computational power between American and Western consumer electronics was plainly visible on store shelves, and that naturally led to concerns about advanced projects coming out of the West Coast. The West was extremely secretive about their advanced projects, but the technology that they had made public was certainly impressive. Stealth aircraft like the Boeing Comanche attack helicopter and Lockheed F-22 fighter made up the backbone of the West's air forces, along with stealth cruise missiles allegedly able to cross the eruption zone undetected. At sea, Lockheed's research into the Sea Shadow stealth ship led to a new generation of stealthy destroyers and frigates, while under the waves, their new generation AIP patrol submarines were virtually undetectable. It has also long been rumored that the West was investing heavily in drone technology to make up for their smaller numbers, and references a program called the Universal Drone Control Protocol and counter-satellite systems have been made in Californian congressional reports. Allegedly, California and Cascadia are investing astronomical sums of money into this research. There are also some who believe this is a cover story for research into new types of nuclear weapons, a rumor that cannot be easily discounted either. The US would do everything in its power to try and dismiss concerns of this alleged gap to the public. Publicly, the Department of Defense dismissed these advanced projects as fantastical and in the prototype stage. Behind closed doors, however, the evidence pointed to the contrary. It's tough to quantify things like technological development, but I can hang my hat on the US being 10 to 15 years behind the West Coast in terms of military technology. By 2017, the West Coast's advanced technology would be on par with the tech that real-world NATO countries would begin fielding around the year 2020, while the fictional US would still be using gear from the early 2000s. Not obsolete, but obsolescent. In some extraordinary cases, the US Department of Defense actually ended up purchasing some tech equipment from countries like Japan or Taiwan indirectly through a third party, such as another NATO country, where their own technology lagged too far behind. There was a risk in doing so, however. The computers inside this equipment could be compromised, at least in theory. In terms of consumer electronics, most new products from the US would be outpaced by the time they hit store shelves, and significantly more expensive. In spite of what the editorials said, the tech gap was real. Before we wrap up, I do want to speak on Hawaii briefly. Hawaii has never been directly involved much in the tech businesses, and that would remain true in our fictional setting. However, recall that the kingdom would establish itself as a nexus of trans-Pacific trade. In addition to being a cheap spot to shop for consumer goods, they would also set up brokerages and exporters that would sell much-needed components to American companies, thereby partially controlling the market in the US itself. Not to mention, providing intelligence on components that could have potential military purposes going to the US and its allies. Until next time.